The morning sun hadn't fully risen when she first noticed something was off. A police cruiser, parked across from the local pharmacy where she worked, its presence both obvious and unsettling. At first, she brushed it off as routine patrol, but deep down, her instincts told her otherwise. She had lived in this small Midwestern town her entire life. As one of the few black healthcare professionals in the area, she had worked hard to build her reputation as a trusted pharmacist. Her regular customers knew her for her warm smile and careful attention to detail, especially with elderly patients who needed extra help understanding their medications. That spring morning in 2019 marked the beginning of what would become a disturbing pattern. The same patrol car, driven by the same officer, would appear during her morning commute, then again during her lunch break, and sometimes even as she locked up the pharmacy at night. The cruiser's presence became a shadow, following her through her daily routine. Her coworkers started to notice too. "That car's been out there 3 times today," her technician would whisper during quiet moments between prescriptions. The officer never approached the pharmacy, never came in as other officers did for coffee or friendly conversation. He just watched, waited, and followed. She began taking different routes to work, leaving at slightly different times, small changes to her routine that shouldn't have been necessary. But the patrol car always seemed to find her. Sometimes it would trail her for blocks, staying just far enough back to maintain plausible deniability, but close enough to send a clear message. The stress started affecting her daily life. She found herself checking her rearview mirror more frequently, her heart racing whenever she spotted a police car, even if it wasn't him. Her hands would shake slightly while filling prescriptions, something that had never happened in her decade of pharmacy work. Friends and family noticed the change in her behavior. During Sunday dinners, her mother would ask why she seemed distracted, why she kept glancing out the windows. Her brother offered to follow her to and from work, but she declined, not wanting to escalate the situation. Besides, she was doing nothing wrong. She had lived an exemplary life. Honor roll throughout school, volunteered at the local food bank, never even had a parking ticket. She started documenting everything: dates, times, locations. Her phone became filled with notes detailing each incident, each pass of the patrol car, each lingering presence in the pharmacy parking lot. Something inside told her these records would matter someday. The situation came to a head one rainy Tuesday morning. As she pulled into her reserved parking spot at the pharmacy, the patrol car appeared, blocking her in. The officer didn't approach, didn't activate his lights, just sat there for long minutes while she remained trapped in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. When he finally pulled away, she sat there for several more minutes, gathering her courage before heading into work. That evening, she made 2 important calls, one to her cousin who practiced civil rights law in the state capitol, and another to the local NAACP chapter. Both conversations lasted long into the night, and both ended with the same conclusion. This wasn't about her doing anything wrong. This was about power, about intimidation, and about a pattern that needed to be exposed and stopped. As she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, she thought about all the others who might have faced similar situations but stayed quiet out of fear. She thought about her young nieces and nephews growing up in the same town. She thought about her responsibility, not just to herself, but to her community. Tomorrow would bring another day of watchful eyes and unwanted attention, but now she had a plan. She would no longer just endure, she would act. Summer crept in, bringing with it a heat that seemed to make tempers rise along with the temperature. What had started as uncomfortable surveillance quickly evolved into something more aggressive. The first traffic stop happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon as she drove home from church, still wearing her floral dress and small hat that her grandmother had given her last Christmas. The officer's reason? He claimed her brake light was out. She knew this wasn't true. Her brother had just checked all her car's lights the previous weekend, a new routine they'd started since the surveillance began. When she tried to show him that all lights were working perfectly, He kept her standing in the heat for 45 minutes, checking and rechecking her license and registration. Her hands trembled as she recorded every detail in her phone's notes app afterward, sitting in her parked car in her church dress, the air conditioning running full blast, but somehow not cooling the anger and fear that had begun to build. This would be the first of 7 stops over the next 3 months, each one more baseless than the last. The second stop came just 3 days later, supposedly for rolling through a stop sign. The third, a week after that, for suspicious driving patterns when she'd simply been following the speed limit. Each time, the same officer. Each time, the same drawn-out process of checking her documents, asking probing questions about where she was going, where she'd been. Her pharmacy coworkers began keeping a log of their own, noting every time the patrol car circled their parking lot. They started walking her to her car after closing, watching until she safely pulled away. One elderly customer, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived in the town for 50 years, witnessed one of the stops and insisted on staying until it was over, her presence both a comfort and a witness. Word spread through the community. Other women came forward quietly at first, sharing similar stories at church gatherings or over coffee at the local diner. They spoke in hushed tones about their own experiences, the lingering follows, the questionable stops, the way their complaints to the department had been dismissed or ignored. The pharmacy's security cameras caught it all. The constant patrols, the way the cruiser would idle in the parking lot, the officer watching through his windshield. Her supervisor, concerned about both her safety and potential liability issues, began saving all the footage. Just in case, he said, though neither of them wanted to think too hard about what that case might be. She changed her routines, but it didn't help. Left home earlier, he was there. Stayed late at work, he waited. Took different routes, somehow he knew. The GPS on her phone became a constant companion, recording every trip, proving she never deviated from speed limits, never ran lights, never did anything to warrant this attention. Each stop brought new, increasingly personal questions. Where did she get the money to buy her car? Did she really earn her pharmacy degree? Who were all these people coming to see her at work? The implications were clear, each question a paper cut to her dignity, her professionalism, her very identity as a respected member of her community. Her mother wanted her to quit her job, move to another town. Her brother offered again to confront the officer directly. But she refused both suggestions. This was her home, her community, her life's work. Running away or escalating the situation wouldn't solve anything. Instead, she kept documenting, kept gathering evidence, kept building her case. The turning point came when she installed a dashboard camera, a small device that seemed to offer at least some protection. Its presence gave her a small sense of control, even as the situation continued to deteriorate. What she didn't know then was that this little camera would soon capture everything. Every word, every action, every abuse of power, during what would become the final and most frightening encounter of all. The July morning started like any other, with humidity hanging thick in the air and storm clouds threatening in the distance. She had just finished her morning shift at the pharmacy, having stayed an extra hour to help an elderly couple understand their new heart medication. The dashboard camera she'd installed 2 weeks earlier hummed quietly as she pulled out of the parking lot. She made it 3 blocks before the familiar patrol car appeared in her rearview mirror, lights flashing. Her heart sank, but her hands were steady as she pulled over, automatically reaching to make sure the camera was still recording. This stop felt different from the start. The officer approached her car with his hand resting on his holster, something he'd never done before. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, not even asking for her license and registration first. The rain had started to fall, light drops creating a gentle pattern on her windshield. Through the drizzle, she noticed a young mother with a stroller had stopped on the sidewalk, phone in hand, watching. "May I ask why?" She responded, her voice calm despite her racing heart. Years of dealing with difficult situations at the pharmacy had taught her how to maintain her composure. The dashboard camera captured everything. Her steady voice, his aggressive stance, the way his face twisted with anger at her simple question. I said, "Step out of the vehicle." His voice had risen, echoing off the wet pavement. She complied slowly, deliberately, remembering her cousin's legal advice about staying calm and following commands while clearly stating her actions. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through her white pharmacy coat. "I'm getting out of the car now," she narrated clearly, keeping her hands visible. "I'm standing in the rain. Can you please tell me why I've been stopped?" More people had gathered on the sidewalk now, watching silently in the rain. She recognized several of her regular pharmacy customers among them. That's when he said it. Words that would later become crucial evidence. "I know where you live. I know your routines. I know everything about you. And I'm going to keep watching until I find something. There's always something with you people." Lightning cracked in the distance as she stood there, rain running down her face, mixing with tears she refused to let fall. The growing crowd of witnesses had their phones out now, recording everything. Her own dashboard camera captured his every word, every threatening gesture, every abuse of the power his badge represented. For 15 long minutes, she stood in the rain while he circled her car, claiming to smell something suspicious. She thought about her father, who taught her to stand tall in the face of intimidation. She thought about her young nephew, who wanted to be a police officer himself one day. She thought about all the people watching, and what they were learning about justice from this display. When he finally let her go, with no ticket, no citation, just a warning to watch herself, she sat in her car for a long moment. The rain drummed on the roof, and her clothes were soaked through, but she felt a strange sense of calm. This, she realized, wasn't just about her anymore. The witnesses on the sidewalk, the recording on her dashboard camera, the obvious abuse of power. It had all come together to create something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. That evening, as she downloaded the camera footage to her computer, her hands shook not from fear, but from determination. The video was clear, the audio perfect. Every threatening word, every intimidating gesture, every moment of that encounter was preserved. She made 3 copies, one for her cousin the lawyer, one for the NAACP chapter president, and one for safekeeping. As thunder rolled outside her window, she began typing her official complaint. The words flowed easily now, backed by months of documentation, witness statements, and now irrefutable video evidence. This would be the last time, she decided, that this officer would abuse his power. Not just for her sake, but for everyone in her community who had ever felt powerless in the face of such intimidation. Little did she know, her dashboard camera had captured exactly what they needed: the smoking gun that would finally bring this situation to light and force the department to confront what had been happening on their watch. The local NAACP office was small, tucked away in a modest building downtown that had seen better days. But inside, the energy was electric. People packed the meeting room, sitting in folding chairs, standing against walls, all there because word had spread through the community about what happened in the rain that day. The chapter president, a retired postal worker who'd served the community for 30 years, played the dashboard camera footage on a projector screen. The room fell silent as they watched, the only sound the gentle whir of an old ceiling fan and occasional gasps as the officer's threats echoed through the speakers. When the video ended, the silence held for a moment before the room erupted. One by one, women stood up to share their stories. A high school teacher described being followed home from night classes. A nurse talked about repeated stops on her way to work early morning shifts. A bank teller shared how she'd changed her route to work, adding 20 minutes to her commute just to avoid certain patrol areas. This isn't just about one incident anymore, the chapter president said, his voice firm with decades of civil rights experience. This is about a pattern that's been hiding in plain sight. He pulled out a map of the town, and together they started marking locations where each incident had occurred, creating a visual web of harassment that could no longer be ignored. Her cousin, the civil rights attorney, took notes frantically, his legal pad filling with details that would later become crucial evidence. "What makes this case different," he explained, standing to address the room, "is the documentation. The video evidence. The witnesses. The pattern of behavior that we can now prove." The pharmacy where she worked became an unofficial headquarters for their efforts. During quiet moments between prescriptions, customers would share their own stories, often in whispers, sometimes with tears. Her coworkers gathered statements, carefully writing down dates, times, and details. The elderly teacher who had witnessed one of her traffic stops brought in a detailed letter she'd written, her elegant handwriting filling 3 pages with her observations. One young woman broke down while sharing her story, explaining how she'd given up a better-paying job in another part of town because she couldn't handle being pulled over 3 times a week on her commute. The room embraced her, both literally and figuratively, understanding her pain, but also her courage in finally speaking out. The local newspaper editor, who'd been quietly gathering information for months, finally had enough evidence to run a story. When it appeared on the front page, the black and white print laying out the pattern of harassment for all to see, more people came forward. The paper's website crashed from the traffic as people rushed to share their experiences in the comments section. Support came from unexpected places. The owner of the diner across from the pharmacy offered free coffee to anyone who came in to give a statement. A retired judge reached out through back channels, providing insight into similar cases and offering guidance. Even some off-duty officers, speaking anonymously, shared their concerns about what they'd witnessed. The evidence mounted: dozens of witness statements, cell phone videos from bystanders, security camera footage from local businesses, detailed logs of encounters, and most importantly, the stories. So many stories that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They created a timeline on the wall of the NAACP office, stretching back years. Each incident was marked with a small dot, and as the dots multiplied, they told a story that was impossible to ignore. The pattern was clear, the evidence overwhelming, and the community's determination unshakable. As they prepared to take the next step, bringing their evidence to internal affairs, she looked around the room at all the faces, both familiar and new, who had come together to stand against injustice. In their unity, she found strength. In their shared stories, she found purpose. And in their collective voice, she found hope that real change was finally possible. The Internal Affairs office felt cold and impersonal, with its stark white walls and uncomfortable metal chairs. She sat with her lawyer cousin, surrounded by 3 serious-faced investigators who had driven in from the state capitol. The manila envelope on the table contained months of evidence: photos, videos, witness statements, and that crucial dashboard camera footage. "Tell us everything," said the lead investigator, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much. "Start from the beginning." For the next 4 hours, she recounted every incident, every follow, every threatening encounter. Her voice stayed steady, even as she described standing in the rain that July day, even as she played the video that captured those chilling threats. The investigation that followed turned the department upside down. Internal Affairs pulled the officer's body camera footage from every traffic stop he'd made in the past 3 years. They discovered a pattern that went deeper than anyone had imagined. The dash cam videos often didn't match his written reports. The timestamps showed him following specific vehicles for hours. The GPS data from his patrol car painted a damning picture of targeted harassment. Word spread through the department like wildfire. Other officers began coming forward, speaking in quiet corners about things they'd witnessed but hadn't reported. A young rookie admitted she'd been troubled by what she'd seen, but hadn't known who to tell. A veteran surgeon expressed regret for not speaking up sooner. The investigators set up shop in a small conference room at City Hall. Day after day, people came to tell their stories. The retired teacher brought her detailed journals, where she documented every incident she'd witnessed over the years. The bank teller shared her GPS records, showing how she'd been forced to change her route to work. The high school teacher brought security footage from the school parking lot, showing the patrol car circling repeatedly during evening classes. Each piece of evidence added to the picture, like a puzzle slowly revealing its full image. The investigators discovered that complaints had been filed before, but they'd been buried, marked as resolved, without any real investigation. They found patterns in the department's handling of similar cases, a system that had protected its own at the expense of the community it was meant to serve. The officer's personnel file told its own story. Previous departments where he'd worked had similar complaints, but they'd been sealed as part of resignation agreements. He'd moved from town to town, department to department, leaving a trail of misconduct that had been carefully hidden from public view. The pharmacy's security footage proved invaluable. Months of recordings showed the patrol car's constant presence, contradicting the officer's claims that he'd just been doing routine patrols. The timestamps matched perfectly with her detailed logs, providing irrefutable evidence of the harassment. One afternoon, she was called back to the Internal Affairs office. The lead investigator spread dozens of photos across the table, screenshots from body cameras, security footage, witness videos. "We've seen enough," she said, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. "This stops now." The investigation had exposed not just one officer's misconduct, but a deeper problem within the department. The lack of oversight, the dismissed complaints, the culture of silence. It all pointed to systemic issues that would require major reforms to address. As she left the office that day, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, she felt both drained and hopeful. The investigation wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time, she knew that her voice, and the voices of all those who had come forward, were finally being heard. The local newspaper ran another story, this time about the investigation itself. The headline read, "Internal Affairs Investigation Reveals Years of Misconduct." The article detailed the scope of the investigation and its preliminary findings, careful not to compromise the ongoing process, but clear enough to let the community know that change was coming. The federal courthouse stood tall against the autumn sky, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps seeking justice. She climbed those steps alongside her legal team, her smart black suit a shield against the morning chill and the crowd of reporters gathering below. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger. The civil rights lawsuit had made national headlines. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Inside the courtroom, every bench was filled. Community members, fellow officers, civil rights activists, and curious citizens all sat shoulder to shoulder, watching as the legal drama unfolded. Her testimony came first. For 6 hours, she sat in the witness box, her voice clear and steady as she recounted months of harassment. The dashboard camera footage played on screens throughout the courtroom, the officer's threats echoing off marble walls. When asked why she hadn't given up and moved away, she looked directly at the jury and said, "Because this is my home, and running away won't solve the problem for those who come after me." The evidence was overwhelming. Hour after hour, witness after witness, the pattern became clear. The retired teacher brought her journals, reading entry after entry of documented harassment. The bank teller shared her Google Maps history, showing how she'd been forced to take lengthy detours. The young mother who'd recorded the rainy day confrontation played her video, her hands shaking slightly as she pointed out details to the jury. Department records reveal the truth behind years of buried complaints. Internal Affairs investigators testified about similar incidents that had been dismissed or ignored. The police chief, now retired, struggled to explain why so many red flags had been overlooked. His testimony was damning, a portrait of institutional failure painted in halting words and uncomfortable silences. Tech experts analyzed GPS data from the patrol car, creating animated maps that showed patterns of surveillance and harassment. Security footage from dozens of businesses formed a digital timeline of intimidation. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of systematic abuse of power. The defense tried to paint the officers' actions as routine patrol work, but their arguments fell flat against the weight of evidence. When they suggested she was oversensitive to normal police presence, the courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief. The judge's gavel restored order, but the damage to their case was done. During breaks in the proceedings, she sat in quiet conference rooms with her legal team, sipping water and trying to stay focused. Through the windows, she could see supporters holding signs on the courthouse steps. Local children had made posters about justice and equality, their colorful artwork a bright contrast to the gray stone building. The officer himself finally took the stand in the last week of the trial. His testimony was a study in contradictions. Dashcam footage didn't match his reports, GPS data contradicted his explanations, witness statements exposed his lies. Under cross-examination, his composure cracked. "These people need to be washed," he snapped, his true attitudes finally exposed in front of the stunned courtroom. As closing arguments approached, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Her legal team had built an airtight case, but decades of similar cases had taught the community not to take anything for granted. The morning of closing arguments, she found a surprise on the courthouse steps. Dozens of bouquets of flowers, placed there by community members who couldn't fit in the courtroom but wanted to show their support. Her cousin, now not just family, but her lead attorney, delivered a powerful closing argument. He spoke not just about the law, but about community, about trust, about the fundamental right to live without fear. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the judge dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, she sat quietly in the courtroom, surrounded by family and supporters. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. This wasn't just about one officer or one department anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about demanding change, about standing up for everyone who'd ever faced similar harassment but couldn't fight back. The jury took just 4 hours to reach their verdict. As people filed back into the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to touch. The forewoman stood, paper trembling slightly in her hands, and read out a decision that would change everything. A complete victory, with both compensatory and punitive damages awarded. The officer and department were held accountable, but more importantly, the verdict mandated sweeping reforms. That evening, as the sun set over the courthouse steps, an impromptu gathering formed. People brought food, drinks, and chairs, turning the courthouse plaza into a community celebration. Children played on the steps where reporters had stood that morning. The elderly teacher who'd kept those detailed journals was there, sharing hugs with the bank teller who'd changed her route to work. The young mother who'd recorded the rainy day incident sat with her toddler, both of them enjoying ice cream cones. But this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. The settlement included funds for a new community oversight board, giving citizens a real voice in police accountability. The department was required to implement new training programs, focusing on bias awareness and community relations. Every patrol car would now have cameras that couldn't be turned off, and a new system for handling complaints was put in place. She used part of the settlement money to establish a nonprofit organization, working to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. The first workshop was held in the same community center where the NAACP had gathered those months ago. Police officers and citizens sat together, sharing stories, finding common ground, working to rebuild trust that had been broken long before this case began. The changes rippled outward. Other departments in nearby cities began adopting similar reforms. The state legislature took notice, introducing bills to address police accountability. Her story became a case study in police academies, teaching future officers about the importance of ethical conduct and community trust. 1 year after the verdict, she stood at a podium in the police academy, addressing a new class of recruits. Looking out at their young faces, she shared not just her story, but her hope for the future. "This badge," she told them, holding up a newly designed police shield that had become a symbol of reform, represents a promise to protect and serve everyone equally. The retired judge who had helped behind the scenes now sat on the community oversight board. The young rookie who had spoken up during the investigation had been promoted to training officer, teaching new recruits about the importance of standing up against misconduct. Even some of the officers who had initially resisted the changes began to see the benefits of improved community relations. The pharmacy where it all began remained a cornerstone of the community, but now for a different reason. Photos on the wall told the story of change. Newspaper clippings, community meeting announcements, pictures of joint police community events. Her regular customers still came in for their prescriptions, but now they also brought stories of positive interactions with the new, reformed police force. 2 years after the verdict, a documentary filmmaker came to town, wanting to tell the story. The crew filmed interviews with everyone involved: community members, police officers, legal teams, and department officials. But the most powerful moment came when they filmed a community picnic in the park, where children played safely while officers chatted with parents, and everyone shared food and stories. As she watched the next generation of officers graduate from the academy, their new badges gleaming in the sunlight, she thought about how far they'd come. The old system of harassment and intimidation had been replaced by one of respect and accountability. The fear that had once permeated certain neighborhoods had given way to a cautious but growing trust. The final scene played out at a community garden planted in what had once been an empty lot near the pharmacy. Officers and citizens worked side by side, planting flowers and vegetables. Children helped water the plants while their parents chatted with patrol officers. The garden became a symbol of their transformed community, something beautiful growing from what had once been barren ground. Her story had become part of the town's history, taught in local schools and shared with visitors. But more than that, it had become a blueprint for change, proving that one person's stand for justice could transform not just a department, but an entire community's future.